Welcome back, everybody.
Was good.
Hello.
This is Center Grace, and this is the Ask Us Anything podcast. And we are here with Pastor Derek and Pastor Nathaniel, and we are answering your hard-hitting questions this week. This week, we're Nathaniel's gonna dive a little deeper on the sermon. So if you missed the sermon, it'll be tagged in the description. If you are on YouTube watching our pretty faces, if you're listening, I'll see if I can link that. We'll see if that works.
I don't know. Link our pretty faces.
Can you link YouTube things in Spotify? Or,
I have no idea.
I think so.
I
don't know
assume.
anything
I
about
think you
technology.
can.
We'll give it a go. So you'll find
Nathaniel
out.
knows nothing about technology.
I'm still on MySpace, guys.
He's catching up.
Make MySpace great again as my new platform.
Is that running? I remember like 2 years ago, they were like, guys, we're shutting down the AOL Instant Messenger servers.
They
guys
probably
remember?
killed
No
MySpace,
way.
but all I know
That's
is
crazy.
Tom. Remember Tom?
I
No.
don't
On
remember
MySpace?
who- who's Tom.
All my fellow millennials know Tom. Tom never tried to destroy our world like Mark Zuckerberg did. So he was the guy who invented MySpace, and he was everybody's like in their top friends. Jesus was also in my top friends. I digress. We're on a timeline today.
All right.
Awesome. Jesus and Tom
Jesus
in
and
your
Tom.
top,
True.
top friends.
Speaking of which, elders.
Yes. Nice segue, Matt. That was good.
Natural segue. We have a question this week. Why are there no blue-collar elders here at Center Grace they're talking about? And they said, and no poor elders. Is this due to the demographics of the church? That is the available selection of qualified men, or have we added unspoken qualifications for the office? Do you think this affects, and then a separate question, do you think this affects the ability to shepherd the whole flock? So why do we not have poor elders?
Yeah.
I was
You
gonna
guys seen
I
that
was
episode
gonna
of The Office where Michael's like with the warehouse guys, The Office, and he goes, "I'm colorblind."
I do remember that
Oh,
one.
Anyway.
Is that where he encourages the people in the warehouse to unionize?
I don't remember.
I was gonna make a joke like, so Derek, why do you not trust the poor, or something like that? And then I was like, sarcasm is just ripe for controversy in podcasts,
is.
so
true.
I'm gonna hold back as much sarcasm as I can. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, I mean it's a fair question, and I do think that a lot of it does have to do with just the demographics, not just of our church, but even of the North Shore.
Sure.
I think that is a big part of it.
Yeah, you can't really be poor and live here almost.
Yeah.
Just a sad reality.
I mean, and I would say that, that being said, I do think that there are people who are in leadership that maybe not at the elder level per se, but whether it's, leadership in terms of other offices, or like the diaconate, or just ministry teams that come from varied backgrounds, and I think even would have different socioeconomic standing. And so, I mean, I think I would just say, like, when I think about our leadership team, both offices and then volunteer leaders, I think it's fairly representative of what you would see in and around the North Shore. I mean, our demographics here are such that, even as Nathaniel just said, it's pretty hard to live on the North Shore of Boston and be in a lower income bracket. Now, again, are there places? I think about even just right across the street from the Cummings Center, like 2 blocks away, there's some low-income housing. And that's one of the realities that we know about as a church. And even as we're like beginning to really ramp up our local outreach team, that's one of the things that we want to think about. It's one of the reasons why, we've tried to partner in a number of ways with Beverly Bootstraps. Like, we do know that there are a number of people who have significant need in and around the North Shore. And I think we're doing what we can to try to meet some of those needs. So those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add other than I think, I was kind of joking, but kind of not joking. Like, to be on the North Shore long term, like, is not a cheap endeavor. But I do think our church skews a little bit more like, middle class.
Yeah.
And so there's an issue of the pool. I do think, I can't remember exactly how the question was worded. I meant to print out the questions, but Yeah, I think there is a downside of not having, socioeconomic diversity, which I would argue we have a little bit of socioeconomic
Yeah.
diversity.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, I would too.
and
How many elders do we have?
Six, if you include me and Nathaniel.
Yeah, that's a small sample size. It's
Sure.
hard to, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the reality of like what you grew up in versus what you currently make. And when you talk about socioeconomic,
Mm.
so just because someone makes a lot now doesn't mean they have a white collar perspective on life. So
That's a
just
good
to add
point.
that qualifier.
That's a great point. Yeah.
I did not grow up in a white collar home, for example, and I know some of our other elders didn't either.
Yeah.
Even though they might be white collar now, but I do think you miss from an active blue collar type perspective. You definitely miss something. The congregation in our polity has the freedom to nominate people for eldership.
Yep.
The elder board has also freedom to say if they don't think they're qualified, because that's the role of an elder. But there's no one stopping the congregation for nominating someone who's blue collar. I do think diversity for the sake of diversity is not always the greatest idea.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So like, hopefully we're not just nominating people, whether they're white collar or blue collar, just for the sake of diversity. However, it's a helpful thing.
Yeah.
I think when diversity becomes the end all, it's harmful. But as a complementary addition, it is almost always helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So, if someone meets all the other qualifications of being an elder and they're blue collar, by all means, somebody nominate them.
Yep.
If you're a member, you have the right to nominate an elder. I do think maybe one hard thing about there being enough of a pool of blue collar workers is like, I think one quality we do look for in an elder is like longevity around the church. Like, are you going to be here a while? Have you been here a while? And I think going back to the initial comments, like the North Shore tends to set itself up to be inhospitable to people, and I just feel like blue collar dynamics sometimes change pretty quickly. Anyway, so sometimes it makes it harder. Like, I'm going to be here, if you're a blue collar person, to confidently say I'm going to be here like for the next 10 years, unless you grew up here. Last thing I'll say is, I think one area that our church in general could reach is people like blue collar, towny type people in the church. I think it's interesting to me, the percentage of our church that didn't grow up here. I would argue is probably lower than some other places. And that may be like Beverly being like kind of a little bit more transient than maybe say Gloucester. But I would like to see more people from Beverly, like kind of more that dyed in the wool Beverly or Danvers or wherever, come to the church. So it's a related, topic.
And one thing I would even add too, love all those thoughts, Nathaniel. One thing I would add too, I think that just as I observe the work of both our elders and deacons, I don't get the sense that most of them being from a more white collar, socioeconomic position now, it doesn't strike me as a limiting factor for the help that they seek to give to other people. Like I do think that both our elders and deacons are available in terms of whether it's shepherding care from the level of and the responsibility of the elder, or helping with the financial and physical needs. Like I think that our elders and deacons do a really good job of meeting the needs of anyone who comes to them as best they can. And so again, while to Nathaniel's point, there might be benefit in terms of complementarity to have a greater sense of diversity upon some of those boards, not just for diversity's sake, but if those people are qualified. I would say that nevertheless, like if someone is just looking at our elder board, let's say, and looks and sees that they're all white collar, I don't think that has ever prohibited any of them from doing ministry to people from other backgrounds. Again, maybe I'm totally missing something there, but I at least know from the intentionality that we're trying to approach shepherding with, that, that's not a, you know, we don't utilize socioeconomic standing or something like that as a means by which we say, well, we're just not going to shepherd that person, or we're not going to pay attention to those
Sure.
needs.
Of course.
So maybe getting to that second question, or the last question there a little bit, does this in some way, shape, or form hinder the ability to do ministry, at least anecdotally, and in terms of, I think, the activity that we are trying to do as an elder board, I don't get that sense.
Would it be fair to say it might be helpful, but it doesn't hinder?
Yeah.
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 Because again, you don't have, I think to that point, like you don't have diversity of socioeconomic status as a requirement in 1 Timothy 3 for an elder.
Right.
board.
Sure.
You have not a lover of money. So if that's kind of the subtext of this question, like, then yes, I would argue like we need, elders who are not lovers of money. But I don't necessarily think that white collar people are prone to be lovers of money always more than blue collar. You could argue maybe there's a little bit of a propensity there. But anyway, I think as I was reading back through the qualifications of an elder, I think we need to be careful, especially in an age of DEI, right? To add things to that qualification for an elder that Paul could have added, but he decided not to.
Right. And okay, one last comment, just even as that makes me even think about, and we've run into this in some other questions in the past, but I think there's a tendency in our culture today to assume that unless someone has actually had the exact same experience, they can't actually speak any form of truth or, reality into a person's circumstance.
Yeah.
And I would just disagree with that. Again, I know that some people are automatically going to rule this example out because I'm going to use the example of Jesus. But like, Jesus had the best stuff to say to sinners, and yet he never sinned. Right?
Yeah.
Like, and there are things that Paul, growing up in a Jewish context, and yet at the same time having a slight Gentile background too. Like, he was able to skate in both ponds, so to speak.
Or if he wasn't married, like he talks a lot about marriage.
Right. Paul was never married, but he talks a lot about marriage. And I just get the sense today that there are a lot of times that, and again, I'm not saying that is the subtext behind this question, but like, just as a slight hesitancy to jump off into that tendency, I think we need to be careful to just assume, well, the only people that can minister to people who are in a blue collar background are people who have a blue collar experience and that are having it right now. I would just challenge that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that all makes sense. I love what you guys are talking about. Nathan, you started talking about it where, if you want to, it's a trap to look at someone and say, oh, they work this type of job. I know who that person is, the experiences that they've had, and I know who they'll be able to connect with and not, right? Like, every person has such different, life experiences. And you could take this and our culture wants to chop this 1,000 different ways, and they would want to take our 6 elders and break them down and say, what's their age? Do we have diversity in age? Do we have diversity in race? Do we have diversity in all of these different things? And the temptation is to do that, and without the focus being on like who is in scripture every day, who is able to teach and point people to scripture when they need it, who is empathetic and compassionate and able to shepherd compassionately. And like you're saying, it's like if there's those other things, and kind of those things can be helpful in having varying perspectives. But even if you think you may hire someone, we may nominate someone to eldership role who is, who's a different, who's black or something like that, and think, okay, now we're going to get a diverse opinion, but it may be that person grew up very similarly to the other elders that we have, and it's actually this other white elder who has kind of a different experience and will be able to reach a different group.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Great stuff.
Cool.
But like they said, if you are a church member, can nominate. So go for it.
That's right.
Nathaniel, you said you wanted to dive a little bit deeper into some of the things from your sermon.
Which I meant I want Derek to dive into the. I wanted to ask Derek. I was just kidding. Yeah, these were just two questions that I've been thinking about. I'm not sure I have great thoughts, but maybe we can all come to some thoughts together.
Yeah, I can't even. I'm trying to remember. Okay, so the first one was: are there ever times where it is wise to withdraw, avoid / flee opposition?
Mm. That's good.
Yeah, I feel like Derek, you know this, and Matt, you probably know this too. Like, whenever you're teaching or talking about something, you're like, I feel like I need to add some footnotes. Like when you write research papers, it's nice. I like writing research papers more than sermons because I can add footnotes that are like, well, here's all the qualifications to what I just said, but you
Right.
can't do that in a sermon. Yeah, and I think there's a couple that come to mind. I don't know about you, Derek, but like I think of Jesus. Is it Mark 5 or 6 or wherever in the Gospels Jesus goes to his hometown and he's receives opposition and disbelief, and he's basically like, what am I going to do with you suckers? Like, he marveled at their unbelief is the phrase Mark uses, because he was not even able to do anything there. And then in a very closely related passage, Jesus says, sends out the disciples 2 by 2, tell them the gospel, tell them the kingdom is near, and if they don't receive it, kick the dust off your feet.
Yeah.
And you might even argue that like Paul's whole disposition toward some of the Jewish communities that are habitually rejecting Jesus could be summarized as like, I've tried, I've said the gospel numerous times, and I'm going to choose to go to places that have not heard the gospel. And again, you've got to like qualify even that with like, was Paul's mission had a unique nuance that not necessarily everybody's mission has. But I do think there are times where it's wise for the sake of the gospel to, I wouldn't say flee opposition, but to change directions. Maybe.
Yeah.
I would say or maybe a way to discern, like, am I running in a different or going a different direction from this opposition for the right reason? Is like, why are you doing it? Are you doing it for self-preservation? Or are you doing it for the sake of the gospel?
Yeah.
Obviously, I think that's on a case-by-case basis. That's the point of wisdom and Christian community. But that's kind of my initial thought is like there are probably some times.
Yeah.
I don't think the Lord's like always stay in opposition, always stay in the hardest, because then you kind of almost get into this opposite of the prosperity gospel. I grew up in a prosperity gospel context, so the salt you need to put on almost everything I say is going to like make it sound anti-prosperity gospel, which I think I probably did a little bit on Sunday, like, you're all gonna die, get over it, like kind of stuff, which is it needs a little bit of salt of like, sometimes you might need to not go into opposition. But I do think it's like what's your motivation? Like, I think it was Martin Luther who wrote a letter or treatise, I don't remember, on when to flee the plague. And he was, I think from what I remember, he struck a pretty helpful balance there where he was like, don't leave if you can help, but also like, don't go spread the plague, when it's unhelpful to spread the plague. And there's probably even a little bit of, wisdom in the COVID era for that, even though the bubonic plague was like 100 times worse than COVID. It was like something like 1 out of every 3 people died in Europe during that time,
I think that's right.
which is just wild. There'd be whole cities where like 60% of the population just died.
That's
so
crazy.
A different level, right?
Yeah.
But even back then, I remember we were having these conversations. Like, I personally don't think for most people it was good to avoid church out of fear that you would, have a different kind of opposition, right? An opposition of a virus, which is a little different. But at the same time, you don't look for it. You don't like, again, that's almost so different. It's probably not a good example, so I'll stop using it. But yeah, there are just some times that if you can avoid it, go for it. But is it for the sake of the gospel? Like, so is it Jesus avoided the opposition so that he could go teach somewhere else and saw the soil was hard. And I think there's times where we have to see that too.
What do you mean when you say opposition? Like, what type of opposition are you talking about?
Super broad. And
Okay.
I think like that's why like witness is super broad. I think when I say the word witness, your average person is thinking like evangelism tracts, which I'm not necessarily referring to. So opposition being like a family member who's stubbornly resisting the gospel, a community or a culture are a society that seems very hard to be a Christian in. I'm using that very broadly. An overall environment where it doesn't seem like there's fruit, whether the fruit is people coming to faith, which is, very obvious fruit, or even fruit like my family's mental health. Anything in between. It's a very broad category. Witness is just like living like Jesus is alive. And that could be with, how you treat your money, how you treat your career, how you treat your family. It could be 1,000 different things. It's what are you testifying to? And so when there is resistance to living as a Christian, are you always trying to run to comfortability, or are you ultimately running for God's glory, which sometimes looks like pushing back and sometimes looks like, this
Pulling
is
back.
exactly pulling back. Right. That's good. Is it, what is the Proverbs like? There's two, like, don't answer a fool
according to the folly of his ways, and then the very next one says, answer a fool according to the folly of his ways.
Exactly. Or like, don't throw pearls before swine, but then also like the sowers scatter seed among all types of soil. So it's like, this is a long way to say it's complicated, which is, I asked the question and maybe this is one of those things you walk away with more questions than responses. So.
Well, I do think that, like you appealed to earlier, Nathaniel, I think it takes a ton of wisdom, and I think that's the difference. Like, wisdom is not, strictly speaking, just a yes or a no answer. Wisdom, in one sense, has enough perspective to basically say, well, it depends. Right? So, like, answer a fool according to the folly of his ways, or don't answer a fool according to the folly of his ways. Which should I do? Well, it depends. Should I not cast my pearls before swine, or should I sow generously? That depends. And I think, one of the good things about doing a series through the book of Acts is we're going to see moments, the deeper that we go, where Paul in one moment stays. Like, I think about in Lystra, for example, Paul gets dragged out of the city. I think this is in Acts 16. He gets dragged out of the city of Lystra and stoned. The people think he's dead, and he gets up and he walks back into the city. Like, for me, I'd be like, I might not be picking up on all the social clues, but I think that they don't want me here. Like, I would have probably said, I'm gonna go someplace else. But Paul goes back into the city for a time, right? But then there's the moment, and I think you're gonna preach Acts 9 in a few weeks, if memory serves, from our preaching schedule. But like, after Paul gets converted, and a number of the ruling council find out that Paul gets converted, he gets lowered down through the wall in the city of Damascus, and he flees.
Yeah.
So Paul even does various things. Like, I think about when he gets arrested. I'm trying to remember what chapter this is going to be in Acts 18, maybe, when he's in Philippi. He appeals to his Gentile citizenship. He's like, you guys arrested me, and I think Silas is with him. It's like, and yet we're Roman citizens. How dare you? And so Paul, he knows how to, for lack of a better way of saying it, he knows how to work the system. But he does it, and this goes back to something that you said, Nathaniel, he does it for the sake of the gospel. He does it for the sake of witness. So I think he leaves Damascus because he knows, if I stay here, they are going to kill me. And God just told me that he has a purpose for me to be the one who is going to suffer much for his sake, but bring the gospel to the Gentiles. So I gotta get out of here. And so he goes, but he isn't going just to save his own skin. He's going because there's a broader purpose at work. He chooses at the end of Acts 20, into chapter 21, even though the Ephesian elders are like, dude, please do not go back to Jerusalem. There's a prophet named Agabus, if you're looking for the name of a kid or something like that, maybe Agabus. I could recommend that. Nice. But Agabus stands up like the night before Paul leaves, and he's like, this is what I see. And he takes off Paul's belt and he binds his hands, and he's like, if you go to Jerusalem, this is going to happen to you. And Paul's like, I'm going. It's a famous verse, Acts 20:24. I consider my life worth nothing to me, if only I may finish the task and complete the race that God has given to me, the task of testifying to God's grace. And, Paul's consideration at all times in those moments is the reality of what will promote the reality of the gospel best. And so I think that's the principle. And sometimes, I'm not saying that Paul, even in a lot of these moments, like in the Damascus situation, probably Paul did not have a great amount of time to be like, which should I do? Should I flee or should I stay? I think Paul made a split-second decision and was able to reflect upon it afterwards. And so again, this idea of like, should we flee? Should we stay? How do you know? Well, it depends. And sometimes I think we're going to have to rely on the presence of the Spirit in the moment for those situations. Other times there may be more time to think, more time to pray, more time to reason. But I don't get the sense, like when Paul was in Lystra, for example, and he was under the heap of rocks that they had just thrown on him. I've got a feeling he wasn't like, well, what should I do? Like I think he just got up and went back into the city in that moment and trusted that the Lord was going to provide for him in the midst of that, and God did. So it depends. But I think we're going to see a lot of this as we move through Acts, which is going to be good because we're going to have to deal with this again.
Yeah.
Which will be good.
Anything to add, Nathaniel?
I think that's good. Yeah. I think it's a good like footnote. We'll return to it in later parts of Acts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you want to move on to, you were wondering, or you wanted to talk more about what does living out Acts 2 and 4 in view of generosity look like in our society?
Yeah, I think if I could go back and do the sermon over again, I would have spent more time on the last part of the passage. Derek, any thought? I know you got to head out in 10 minutes, so I'll let you start.
Well, one thought that I have, and we'll see this a little bit in the passage I'm preaching on this week with Ananias and Sapphira, I think it's really easy to read Acts 2 and Acts 4 where it talks about like...
And just to clarify specifically, Acts 2, 42 to 47, and the second part of Acts 4. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
I just realized I never specified that.
Totally fine. What I know you're probably thinking about is like that everybody was selling all that they had and giving to those who had need.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I
So
assumed.
Yeah.
I didn't even know which verse. I'm just like, I think Acts. I'm like,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, to
right?
the listener that's like, wait, all of Acts 2 and all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those two specifically. Yeah. I forgot to specify the verse. My bad.
No, it's good. So, I think it was good that you made the distinction between personal property and private property. I think it's a good way of thinking about it. I think it's a helpful framework. And, again, for those who may not have heard the sermon, personal property is what you own, but you're still willing to share. Private property it's just mine. You could think of the birds in Finding Nemo that are just constantly going, mine. Like that's the vision of, I think, of private property in one sense. And in America, of course, like we're all about the idea of private property. That's mine. And, if somebody says, can I borrow that? You're like, well, yeah, I guess. But the idea of like, could I have that? Because I have need, a lot of times our default posture is going to be, well, no, like it's mine. Go get your own. And I think that part of what you see, and we'll even see this a little bit this week in Acts 5, I'm preaching on Ananias and Sapphira, a little preview of this week, but it's not wrong to have personal property. And even from the text that we'll look at this week, it's not even wrong. It wouldn't have been wrong for Ananias and Sapphira to have sold what they did, been honest about how much they actually got for their land, and kept a little bit of the proceeds for themselves.
Sure.
Peter actually highlights that. He's like, it's yours. Like it was yours before you sold it. It's yours after you sell it. Just don't lie to us, and tell us that you're given everything. And so I think that learning how to live in an Acts 2 or an Acts 4 kind of way, I think a lot of times our minds rush to the extreme, and it's like, we all need to sell everything and put it into a common pot, and we're just we're gonna take as we have need. Well, that's not necessarily what what Acts 2 and Acts 4 is really trying to get at. But the spirit of generosity that is present, because of the reception of great grace, that was one of the repeated phrases in the text Nathaniel preached out of this last week. Because of the reception of great grace, there was great generosity. They overflowed with great generosity. And I think, the way that we live into this is beginning to see our personal property as shareable. Nathaniel made or gave the illustration that when we were talking with deacons, and I think it was actually even when we were talking with Corey as an elder, Rich, one of our elders, asked the question, do you have anything, do you own anything that you are just unwilling to share?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair question. And if there is, like, I probably need to think about my attachment to that thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think living into that spirit of generosity and capturing that spirit of generosity is one of the ways that we live into it. I also think, and just my last comment is, in the Old Testament, when it came to the idea of giving, 10% was the law, right? The tithe was the law. But you see in the New Testament an overabundant amount of generosity. And it was even anticipated in the Old Testament that people would give above their 10% because they would give a free will offering. They would give they would pour out a drink offering. There are all kinds of things that even in the Old Testament were happening. But I think one of the ways that we can live into Acts 2 and 4 is practicing a generosity that is, again, countercultural. We've been asked a number of times, how can we live in a way that is different than culture? We've talked about practicing the Sabbath. We talked on Saturday during our membership class, one countercultural thing you can do is join a church. That's countercultural. Become a member. But then also share. Be generous. That's countercultural. So
this reminded me of, sorry, I was pulling up something on my phone.
Go for it.
Shout out, Derek. You should have mentioned this when you were talking about the books and your favorite books and authors.
I thought of one. You Are Not Your Own. Alan Noble. Sorry. I meant to say that.
There you go. So two things to note. The other thing is, after that podcast ended, Derek said, by the way, on Spotify, you can get, if you have Spotify Premium, like most of C.S. Lewis's books are on there.
Yep.
So I was listening to Mere Christianity this week, and
good.
on his chapter on charity, he says, and I just like copied this and sent this to like half the people I knew. Who have like
good.
close
You posted it on your
relationships.
MySpace.
I'm like
It's on
conviction.
his
I'm like, if I'm feeling convicted, y'all need to feel convicted.
Absolutely.
There ought to be things we should like to do and cannot do because our charities expenditures exclude them.
So good.
So just like, if you can do and you can buy everything you want, and
But you
whatnot.
owe it to yourself to get nice things from you.
yeah.
I've heard people say that. Like, I owe it to myself. I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah,
You're not your own.
that's true.
Which is why you should read the book by Alan Noble. That's my favorite book anyway.
Yeah.
That I've read in the last few years. Yeah, I think I don't really have any strong answers to this. This is a question I've been wrestling with for like about 10 years, since I had a professor in college who made us read a book called he gave me a book called The Life of St. Anthony by Athanasius, where it's a story of the first monk who, heard a sermon where Jesus said, on the rich young ruler and sell everything and follow me. And he's like, okay. And he did. And I just remember the professor saying something to the effect of, I think our greatest blind spot in the American church is how we spend our money. And the more I studied church history, you get a lot of people that are quick to hit the cancel button for certain people throughout church history, whether it's Martin Luther's views of the Jews, whether it's some, Christians' views of slavery, or not necessarily views of slavery, but the fact they had slaves. Whether it's the early church's view of sex, they were a little, sex is demonized. Anyway, you could go a lot of examples. I think it's good to critique and even condemn a lot of those positions, or different Christians have had throughout the church. The danger is when we don't let them critique us or condemn us. And I think the only way you can read your blind spots, and C.S. Lewis says this, and ironically, his introduction to I say ironically because it's a book by Athanasius, and C.S. Lewis, because you just mentioned C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis's introduction to On the Incarnation, he says, the only way to know your blind spots is to read Christians throughout history, and I would maybe add Christians throughout the world. But the way they spend their money is radically different than the way almost every Christian I know spends their money. And I'm not saying I'm virtuous in this category, and I'm not saying I know the right way to do it. I just have a good sense that if you were to resurrect past Christians, what they would first critique about us, maybe above anything else, is how much money we spend on ourselves, and how much we look to possessions, particularly experiences, particularly, to go back to the question last week about trying the newest thing. And they would be very uncomfortable with what we do. And again, I am not saying that as someone who does a good job. I'm just saying that is like, is this our generation's slavery? Is this our generation's crusades? Is this our generation, like the big, blind spots throughout church history? Are people 500 years from now, after, America gets burned to ashes and they're all living in like, different types of societies? I'm just kidding, but not entirely kidding. Are they going to look back and be like, what was really wrong with the American church was they spent so much dang money on themselves.
Yeah.
While they're, people across the world were dying. I say all that. And then I also want to add a caveat of like, our society is far different with the welfare system. To where it's like, we don't, at least to the best of my knowledge, we don't have anybody in our church that has starved to death ever. Right.
Sure.
And that's like, the culture looks a little different. Like, they didn't have $100,000 medical bills, in the ancient world. You didn't have to pay 30 years to afford an 800 square foot condo, in the ancient world. Like,
Yeah.
so I don't say that to dismiss what I just said, but I'm like I think it's something that we should think more about. I have a feeling 90% of us err on, maybe 99% of us err on spending too much money, having too high a view of our possessions. And I think a large part of that is the cultural current of consumerism. And to whatever degree we can withdraw from habits of consumerism or temptations to consumerism, I think we should.
Yeah.
I didn't give any kind of solid practical answer. Those are all just the things my anxieties for the last 10 years.
Yeah. I think you're just observing that like Christians in the church in general should look far more distinct from our culture than we actually do.
Absolutely.
Right? Like we look by our spending far too similar to those who aren't Christians. And that makes no sense. Right.
Yeah. That's very true.
Yeah.
It's good.
Okay. Anything to add there? Are we good?
That's good, man.
We can talk
Good
more about
word.
it next week if we have follow-up questions.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And okay. Once again, send in your questions on the website. I think you can find it, or you could always just email one of these guys. This is the Ask Us Anything podcast. We are Center Grace Church here in Beverly, Massachusetts. We look forward to answering your questions. And we meet here in Beverly. 9:00 is Sunday school, and then church service at 10:15 in Beverly, Mass. Cool. Peace. See you next week.
Peace.
Grace and peace.